handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman, Seattle. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder, Seattle.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress, Mike Charlie, 4-3-5, 9-2-1. Grid to mark, Mike Charlie, 4-7-3, 8-9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds AGPT, gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Denise Simon Experience, heard worldwide on Mojo 50. I actually have my favorite Democrat with me. It's actually the second round of Truth Be Told, because I interviewed poor David a couple of weeks ago, but he was so mobile on his cell phone, the quality of the interview was so bad we had to scrap it. So David Kirby has been kind enough to join us again. And he is the author of yet another book titled When They Come For You, How Police and Government Are Trampling Our Liberties and How to Take Them Back. Now, this is written by a Democrat who I just said was my favorite Democrat. And, you know, it's an interesting read, because we all feel like, you know, we can walk from our front door to the end of the driveway and we've probably broken about 7 laws. But David's been kind enough to join us to talk about his book, When They Come For You. Welcome, Mr. David.
Thank you. I think you're my new favorite Republican. So.
Thank you. Well, we do sometimes have some things in common. And I would say when it comes to the Bill of Rights, which is our protection against government stupidness on us, that is what is supposed to protect us. And in so many cases, I mean, I see them almost daily, we're not being protected. I would also argue that members of our House of Representatives, you know, our little Congress people on the House side that we send to Washington, D.C., their sole job is to help protect us and those in their district.
And
I
uphold
see
the Constitution of the United
Yes. So, David, your book, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is found on Amazon.com that you can pre-order. And I hope you will, because I think it's an interesting public service that David's really done for us. Go to Amazon.com When They Come For You and pre-order. You'll be doing yourself a big favor, I think, especially to have some interesting discussions around, you know, the dinner table, perhaps. But
Just one point of information: there's a novel by the same name, so be sure you order that.
David Kirby. So, David, what really motivated you to write this? Is it just because you are seeing things kind of like I do, that we have so many injustices that are going on out there?
Well, actually, and you'll appreciate this, the idea originally came from abuse of code enforcement regulations in Florida. I have a friend who used to live in Florida. He owned some property there. And they would just get violation after violation, and they were racking up thousands of dollars in fines, and they would go to court and they would see people who had racked up $50,000 in fine, and they had to foreclose on their houses. And he's from Venezuela. He, you know, escaped the Maduro regime, so he is very sensitive to oppressive government measures. And he told me about it, and he said, you should really, you know, write a book about all the ways that government authority interferes with our lives and abuses their power. And I started looking into it, and it
was shocking.
It was shocking. My book is shocking. I had no idea that half the things I wrote about go on in this country, and they go on every single day. And I agree with you that this is not a right or left issue. This is a right or wrong issue. Mm-hmm. And it's not a partisan book. I take plenty of shots at the Obama administration. This has been going on for quite a while. I would argue it got worse under Obama. I would also argue it's getting worse under the current administration. But it shouldn't matter. I mean, we can argue over Trump. We can argue over immigration and taxes and climate change, et cetera, et cetera. But when it comes to our most basic fundamental rights, I think it's something that unites the left and the right. And in some cases, when I write about things like civil asset forfeiture, which is horrible, that's something where the far left and the far right completely agree that it's outrageous and unconstitutional and out of control.
Let's talk about civil asset forfeiture here for a second, because there are some abuses out there, and you hear some of them. You have to kind of go look for them to hear the volume and what the conditions were. And I'm almost of the notion, David, when it comes to civil asset forfeiture, that rather than seize in many cases, or perhaps most cases, seize the assets, which a lot of times would have something to do with whatever somebody happens to have in their car, but most of all, it's money. Instead of necessarily seizing it, you could almost attach kind of a lien on it so the government doesn't fully take it. Because in so many cases, David, when it comes to civil asset forfeiture, once the government takes it, whatever it may be, you'll go broke ever getting it back, if you do ever get it back for the right reasons.
Most people give up and walk away.
Yes.
The legal fees are often more than the amount that the government took. Sometimes the government will say, okay, we took $6,000 from you. We'll give you $3,000 back if you just walk away. And most people say, yeah, I'll do it. Even though they have done nothing wrong, they have not been accused of a crime, they have not been arrested for a crime, they have not been prosecuted for a crime. It's the property itself that gets prosecuted. It's the United States of America against $4,375. It's the state of California against 423 Bradbury Street. And again, nobody, in my book, the people who suffer this did not commit a single crime.
I've seen that.
And yet, there's a story of a motel owner in Massachusetts, and in like a 30-year period, there were 15 drug arrests within the motel rooms. And he had worked with the police on surveillance and allowed them to come on the property and check the guest records. And he literally worked with the police. And the federal government, under Obama, decided, nope, we're going to take his motel. And they seized it. And it was worth about $1.3 million, and it was paid in full. And in his deposition, one of the federal investigators said, well, we always look at the value of a property before we move, and if it's below $50,000, we don't bother with it. So in other words, they're looking for small, independent business owners with a lot of equity, and they go after them. And in that particular case, it was what's called equitable sharing, where the town partnered with the Department of Justice, which has much more resources to come in and prosecute. Justice takes the money, keeps 10% or 20%, and gives 80% back to the town. So they're basically outsourcing to the federal government to take people's property away.
Your book is really a collection of these kinds of stories, and they're out there. You got to go find them, in which case you could probably write a book in 10 minutes. But in your particular case, how long did it take you to pick and choose individual shocking cases, if you will, that really drove the point home?
Well, it didn't take long to find them. A simple Google search, Google Child Protective Services abuses, and you'll get thousands and thousands of hits. Yeah. Google civil asset forfeiture, likewise. Warrantless home raids, likewise. So, I looked at myself as a curator. I wanted to choose stories that were representative, that had a good geographical mix, a good racial mix, a good socioeconomic mix, to drive home the point that this can happen to anybody at any time. Rich people tend to not fall victim to these things quite as much. for obvious reasons. But the rest of us are really at the mercy of the government. And so I picked stories, yes, that were shocking, but they're not out of the norm. I think they're pretty representative of what's going on out there.
So we started off with having, our House of Representatives that come, we vote in office that come from our districts. And I'm rather stunned that so many of them don't even speak to any of these kinds of things, the violations of so many of the protective amendments that we have. Illegal search and seizures, government regulations, revenue agents, and freedom of the press. It's remarkable to me, David, that you can call them up and you get nothing, even if you even try and call them up, right?
Everybody talks about the Bill of Rights, but how many people have actually sat down? And how many people actually understand what they say? People think, for example, the Fifth Amendment is only about not incriminating yourself. That's just one tiny part of the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment is huge, and the most important thing it's supposed to guarantee is due process. No, you cannot deprive anybody of life, liberty, or property without due process, and yet we see that happening all the time. I agree. This issue does not get the attention it deserves. In the 2016 election, I don't think it came up. I don't see it coming up in this election. I don't see any of the candidates talking about this. I could be wrong. We hear about police abuse, and that's fine. That needs to be addressed. But that's, one part of the bigger picture. And there are some members of Congress who have taken action at reform. And like so much else in Congress, it goes to committee and it dies. I will say, in the Republican Party, Rand Paul is probably the person fighting most for these types of things. But I'd be hard-pressed to name very many other senators. You would say, where's Bernie Sanders? Where's Elizabeth Warren? Where's Kamala Harris? Where's Cory Booker? I don't hear them talking about these things.
The big word or two words that you just used was due process. And I interview an awful lot of the lawyers talking about specific cases from the Pacific Legal Foundation. And the majority of their cases are property rights, where they sue the government over ridiculous things. And it generally has to do with water.
Yep.
And, these people that, have property and they want to do something to the property, and because of EPA regulations, they're being fined for this and fined for that, or they're being arrested as their property is about to be seized because of violations of the Clean Water Act, when in fact there's not water, any navigable, useful waterway, or even down to puddles within 200 miles.
Well,
so do you find that property rights are probably one of the more abusive tactics of government regulations and government law, like the Clean Water Act?
I think that does happen a lot, and I think it's extreme. Now, as a good lefty, I'm obviously an environmentalist, and I support the EPA, and I support the Clean Water Act, and there are cases where people are either polluting water. I wrote a book about factory farming, and they pollute groundwater and surface water like crazy and get away with it. So those kinds of regulations I fully support. But things like people getting arrested for collecting rainwater on their roof, the city will say, no, that water belongs to us. If it's against the law, tell them to stop. But don't go and arrest them and fine them. It's abusive, and it's unnecessary.
Search and seizures. What are your? Yeah, help us on that one.
Well, I have several chapters pertaining to that. And of course, now we're talking about the Fourth Amendment, another extremely important amendment. Things like police raiding homes based on a suspected crime that did not necessarily take place without a warrant. Police cannot enter onto your property without a warrant or your permission. They can enter into your front yard, but if they go anywhere that's in the back of your house that's protected from public view, that's something that's called curtilage, and they have no business peeping over your fence, walking in your backyard, going next door and looking from a second-floor window into your backyard. Anywhere that's off limits to the public, out of public view, is protected, and it requires a warrant signed by a judge to enter. And yet this happens all the time. I also talk about strip searches, and women in particular who are just pulled over for having a tail light out, and then the cops get suspicious, and maybe they think they smell marijuana or whatever, and they strip search these women on the roadside. It's just unbelievable. So those are just two examples.
Yeah, we can go on. I think the last time you and I spoke, I wanted to cut down a very dead pine tree in my yard. Very, very dead. And I had to go over to the county. I had to pay them a large fee in order to get a permit. And then they had to send an inspector out first, and I had to mark the tree, like you couldn't see which one it was. And then they gave me the permit, and then I had to turn around and go hire somebody to cut it down. Now, the tree's mine, so they're permitting me to cut down my own tree?
I don't understand that. You own that tree. I don't believe we have those laws in New York. I have a property upstate in the country, and you can cut down any goddamn tree you feel like. Excuse me, any tree you feel like. You don't need to tell the town. You don't need to get a permit. It's your property. It's your tree. So I think Florida in particular is one of the worst states in this regard. I have a feeling California is pretty bad too.
Well, I moved here from Georgia. I generally don't talk about myself on radio interviews, but, it's very different, certainly from Georgia to Florida, replacing a dead hot water heater. Again, I had to go get a permit. I had to have an inspection. I had to do this and do that. Like, who cares? Who cares? It's my hot water heater.
In New York, if you're the homeowner and you're doing the work yourself, you don't need a permit.
Right.
You can even do your own electrical and plumbing if you know how. If you hire someone, they have to be licensed, et cetera, et cetera. They need a permit. But if you yourself are doing the work, you don't need a permit, which I think is perfectly reasonable.
So, David, what's the cure? Where do we start? Do we start with chapter 4 or we start with chapter 6?
We vote, we go to candidate forums, we encourage the media to ask these questions of our leaders, we write to Congress, but a lot of this, it's not just on the federal level. Most of my book takes place, the abuses at the state and local level. And, people don't get involved until it happens to them, unfortunately, because they don't think it will happen to them. Now, there are groups out there, both, large legal foundations and even things like parent groups that are organized against CPS, for example. And my CPS chapter is absolutely the most horrifying in the entire book, Child Protective Services. But it's up to us to push these issues. And again, the media is a really good place to start, and going to town halls where your representative is meeting with constituents. Stand up and ask them, what are you doing to protect the Bill of Rights? I don't know if they're going to have a good answer for you.
So do you have, any particular right that's probably more abused than any of the others, or are they pretty much equal? What does that look like to you?
That's a great question. Again, for me, it's Child Protective Services, because it's one thing to take away your money. It's one thing to take away your house. It's even one thing to lock you up for something you didn't do. But to take your child away in the middle of the night based on an anonymous tip from someone you will never be able to confront in a court of law, and you're up against a system that is designed to take these children away and place them in foster care or adoption because it brings in money for the system. Mm-hmm. And then in family court, the judges basically just listen to the social workers. The prosecutors listen, It's just so rigged against the parents. I have one story. It took them 4 years to get their daughter back because the mother's father accused the husband of molesting the girl. Mm-hmm. And it was a total fabrication. But he was a minister at a local church, and one of his parishioners was, lo and behold, the supervisor of the local county CPS.
Oh, swell.
And they falsified documents. They fought. They lied. They did everything they could to keep that poor girl away from her parents. And it took them 4 years to get her back. And by that time, she was damaged. I mean, she was emotionally a wreck. They all were. Now, they sued. They won $1.5 million. But I'd rather have my kid for 4 years than $1.5 million.
Yeah, and I got a message from a lady the other day in a county not too far from me that she's the grandmother, and the parents of the daughter. There was a custody battle because the parents, between the two of them, had 53 felonies against them, and they're still out on the streets. Yet another problem. And in this custody battle, because the grandmother wanted to get custody because this child was in a bad situation. But in this particular case, the judge said, no, the child's better off with the biological parents that have 53 felonies, including substantial in-home drug abuse.
Well, you know,
it goes from the sublime to the ridiculous. Yes.
Because if they don't do their job properly, children will suffer and die. But if they do their job, how can I say, overzealously, children will be harmed. And children are harmed in foster care all the time. They're sexually abused in foster care. So I know that there are good social workers out there. I know that they do want to protect children at risk. But if they focus more on the children at risk and left the children who aren't at risk alone,
right,
they would go a lot further to solving the problem of child abuse. It's a waste of resources.
Well, when they come for you, how police and government are trampling our liberties and how to take them back. This book, ladies and gentlemen, is really a true public service. It kind of, David Kirby has given us some arrows in our quivers and has suggested that when these candidates, wherever they are, they could be presidential candidates, they could be congressmen, or they could be senators, they could be even in your local legislature, your state legislature. You have a duty, I call it citizens' duty, to challenge, ask some of these hard questions. And most of the time, I would say you may not get any kind of a real answer. You'll get an answer that's just built out of platitudes. Is that about right, David?
Unfortunately, yes. So if you do this, be prepared for that and hold them to it. Don't just ask the questions. Demand answers, real answers, not gobbledygook that these politicians spew all the time to try to make you feel better. Listen to every word they say and call them on it. And ask for specifics, because they never give specifics. You know, I believe in civil liberties and individual freedom. Well, what are you doing about it? What have you done about it? Tell me what votes you've taken.
Yeah, what case? Yeah. What
case have you?
What legislation have you introduced for?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I do want to also say, I think, as a journalist especially, threats to the First Amendment, threats to press freedom, whether on the left or the right, is extremely concerning. Again, this started in the Obama administration.
Yep.
Eric Holder spied on
Reuters,
AP.
Yes, AP, sorry.
Cheryl Atkinson at CBS.
Yes.
They planted monitoring equipment inside her computer.
Yes.
It turned out to be linked to the United States Post Office, if you can believe that. And another case of a reporter at the Washington Times who was writing about the TSA Air Marshal program and how deficient it was. And one day they raided her house because her husband was accused of having illegal firearms. They didn't just confiscate his firearms. They went through all of her files. And they took thousands of documents that had confidential sources, that had, all kinds of stuff that the government had no business getting their hands on. Eventually they returned it all, but they said they destroyed any copies. Yeah, right. And again, that was the Obama administration lashing out at a conservative journalist. And I would stick up for that journalist as much as I would stick up for somebody at Huffington Post or the New York Times.
His book is When They Come For You. Please go get it. Amazon.com. David Kirby, When They Come For You. Mr. David, thanks so much for being with us. I'm having you back because I love these kinds of conversations. And ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way on Denise Simon Experience, so stay with us. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Denise Simon Experience, heard worldwide on Mojo 50. Well, we don't have to talk about Russia, but now we get to talk about China. And so there's a book that's going to hit the bookstores here in October, but I want you to pre-order it. So if you run on over to Amazon.com and all the rest of them, Barnes & Noble, you can pre-order Stealth War, How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept. This is a book that was authored by Brigadier General Robert Spaulding, U.S. Air Force retired, and he's been kind enough to join us on the Denise Simon Experience. Obviously a major, interesting perspective that General Spaulding would have. But with that, welcome, sir.
Thank you so much.
Let me ask you this. How much of this book did you have to have approved before it went to a publisher?
Oh, the whole thing had to be approved.
Yeah.
So,
what is that process like?
Well, you send the manuscript to the Department of Defense, and then they, go through all the places that you worked, and they send it off for them, each of those agencies, to essentially approve, what you've done.
How long is that process?
Usually takes between 4 and 6 months to get done.
Oh, okay. I would have thought it would have taken a little bit longer. Well, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
General, I'm of the notion that we kind of gave up at least 8 or 10 years on addressing China when for other, things, the overseas contingency operation, war on terror, and whatnot, when we should have been focusing or having, because we can do more than one thing at a time, we should have been focusing on a lot of things regarding China. That China has been, I would say, essentially a predator for decades. Is that kind of your argument, sir?
Oh, absolutely. And more than a predator, they've been parasitic. So, a predator will kill you all at once. A parasite, though, eats you slowly over time. So, I think a parasite would be a better analogy.
There are so many facets to what China has been doing to the United States, and I'm not just saying we're the only victim. We're the only country that's a victim. Several other countries are. And it's really quite curious how some of these other countries, along with the United States, in the last, 8 or 10 years, haven't kind of gotten together and say, hey, we need to address these things. And that would include Chinese operatives that have been dispatched to various countries to do, I would say, some nefarious things, including into industry, into academia. But then, stealing technologies, trade, and all these things. Why did that ever happen? Did we just kind of take our eye off the ball?
Yeah, essentially what we believed at the end of the Cold War, we believed that all we needed to do as a country, we'd won against the only real totalitarian regime in the world, main totalitarian regime, and so we had no competitors, and so we believed that democracy was going to thrive, and the way that we wanted to approach that from a foreign policy perspective was based on economic theory and social theory. The economic theory says open markets lead to wealth, and social theory says that wealth leads to democracy. And so essentially our foreign policy really became about opening markets. And we stopped talking about democratic principles, rule of law, human rights, or civil liberties. In fact, as I was learning to be a diplomat, working with the People's Liberation Army, we were told don't talk about these things in public about human rights with regard to China, because we did that in private. And so, in essence, what we did is to stop really pushing these things. We really worked on open markets in anticipation that over time, China would democratize. They would liberalize politically, and they would get freedoms, once they had, their economy had grown enough. And of course, the Chinese Communist Party loved this because they were able to, at the same time, see the enormous advantage that they could have because we were essentially allowing them to have the keys to the kingdom, and they took advantage of it and re-engineered their society, where it had originally been very focused on, directing labor at the unit level on what they're going to produce and what the prices had to be, to having a much more open capability to essentially get rich, but having no freedoms with regard to freedom of speech or religion, or really freedom from an oppressive, regime. And so they took globalization, the internet, and they essentially operationalized it to create advantage for them and their companies and their people everywhere.
Gerald, where did this doctrine come from? From a State Department, or was this, CIA? Was this, was it more than one agency that we would continue to manage China or Beijing with kid gloves?
I don't think it came from anywhere so much as it was described. And if you remember, at the end of the Cold War, it seemed a little bit like we were cast adrift because, we had this one foreign policy kind of focused on competing with the Soviet Union. And then all of a sudden the Soviet Union was gone. And so, it's time to celebrate. And the way you celebrate in a capitalist economy is, people go out and try to do business and try to do business intellectually. And so, when guys like Thomas Friedman wrote, the world is flat, and there was, all of this discussion about, globalization and how it would benefit and promote democracy and, this open world, there was just not a lot of realization that there were other societies, other governments, repressive governments, that really wanted to take advantage of their people for their own benefit and to stay in control, and that they would use this system to do that.
General, did China worry you for a very long time, or was there some collection of specific actions by Beijing that you decided to write the book?
Well, that's actually a really good question. I lived in China from 2002 to 2004. It's when I was a young major in the Air Force, and I was selected for this program to go and study abroad. And I went to China, and I lived in Shanghai, and I traveled all over the country and studied at a university in Shanghai called Tongji University, and learned the language before I went. So I went to Defense Language Institute and learned to speak Chinese fluently. And then when we went over, and I took my family, we lived there for 2 years, and we loved the Chinese people. It was a very vibrant place, and all of the Fortune 500s there were building businesses at that time, and I thought it was fantastic. And so I remember leaving China in 2004, thinking I want to come back here and start a business, because after I retired from the Air Force, it seemed like a really good idea. Fast forward to 2014, when I'm at the Pentagon, and I've been, at this time, I'd been introduced through the Council on Foreign Relations as a fellow to a lot of the business people that were doing business in China. And I got a briefing that was developed by one of our main audit companies about, all of these stories of Chinese, of American companies that are basically have lost their intellectual property or the technology. And I began to put things together. And, I had at the time probably one of the best China teams in Washington, D.C. So it was all full of officers that had spent time in China, spoke the language. And so we just started to really focus on, the Chinese Communist Party and what it was doing. And it was at that point that, I had an aha moment that, oh my gosh, this place that, everybody thought was benign is actually undermining us. And the reason I did that is because as a B-2 pilot, we trained to essentially take things apart, but we used bombs. And so what I recognized from this briefing was that the Chinese were taking apart our society, but they weren't using bombs. They were using ones and zeros and dollars and cents, essentially data and money.
Is this hybrid warfare, kinetic? I mean, how would you really classify it, or is there one?
Yeah, I would not. I don't like those terms because it doesn't really express. It doesn't express the true how broad it is, and how. So you have to be more precise. It is using all the elements of economic and social behavior, or economic and social organization to undermine a country from within. So finance, trade, investment, immigration, media, politics, the internet, all of them become avenues for attack, and each one of them supports the other avenues. And so the internet is used sort of like a binding agent to ensure that you synchronize everything. But really it relies on ingeniously kind of America's precepts, which is, let people be people. And so align your national interests with the private profit motive, except, in the case of the Chinese Communist Party, you have a very few number of people that kind of set the conditions that they want. They have incentives like, bank loans and regulations that benefit, Chinese companies. And so they say, okay, well, we want to be dominant in artificial intelligence and robotics. And then we incentivize people in the country to go out and pursue those things. But not just in our country, we incentivize the corporate behavior of all countries to essentially do what we want. So it's actually really an ingenious way to turn capitalist behavior on its head and make it, instead of promoting democracy, promote totalitarianism.
Would it be prudent, or I'm sure you have already taken a look at it. I mean, Russia has what we have come to know as the Gerasimov doctrine. And I'm of the notion, so you're going to have to help me out because I don't have the credentials that you do, General, but it would almost seem that China, Beijing, is using the exact same playbook globally, and certainly against their enemies, if you will, the United States and allies, the same as Russia. Do those two doctrines, in your opinion, are they similar or the same, or are they being shared?
I think there are some similarities, but I mean, when you really think about it, the Chinese are so embedded in just about all elements of our society in a way that allows them to, while not at every instance pursuing, what the Communist Party wants, but instead pursuing their own interests, and because of the incentives are built in such a way that as they pursue their interests, they get rich, then it really becomes, part of the fiber of the society. And so, a lot of these companies that I was mentioning in this audit company report, they had things like, they were able to see that in this one instance where the private equity company had essentially targets for recognizing when their companies were essentially coming under duress and operate underneath that. And the reason they were able to operate underneath that is because they understood the private equity's business model in a lot of ways better than they did. And so they become so much a part of how we run our country and society that they know everything that we do. And so it makes it much easier for them to get inside that. But they're not just doing it to promote the Communist Party. They're also doing it because they want to get rich.
Yeah, I was going to say greed and power.
Right.
General, can you list just a couple items for the listeners on the things that China is, in fact, guilty of doing inside the United States, just for context?
Yeah, and when you say guilt, and I think in a lot of ways, guilt is on us, and I'll explain that.
Yes.
So, for instance, our retirement funds are sending billions of dollars over to China because MSCI Emerging Markets Index just went from 5 to 20% weighting in Chinese securities. So now you have all of these retirement funds and university endowments rebalancing their portfolios to own more Chinese stocks. And they did that because China pressured the MSCI Emerging Markets Index to essentially change that weighting. And so now you have, instead of that money going to, for instance, invest in U.S. companies, it's going to invest in Chinese companies. And so there's some ramifications of that. One is that the Chinese can use this money to build the Belt and Road Initiative, to power things like Made in China 2025, to build, buildings, to build bridges, to keep Chinese employed by using overcapacity in their industries, and to not only that, also build their weapon systems so they can build, aircraft carriers and planes and tanks and especially ballistic missiles. So, but at the same time, if you're a startup in the United States, a high-tech startup, for instance, nobody's going to invest in your company. All the venture firms are investing in Chinese companies instead. And they're doing that because at the same time, China's taking some of that investment and turning around and matching the funds of the venture capitalists. So we've dried up the capital for companies that are building things in the United States, and essentially promoted the kind of activity that the Trump administration is trying to stop in China. So that's just in the finance realm.
Yikes. Academia. Explain some of that.
So in academia, you have three elements going on there. One is the suppression of speech on the campus, and so the Chinese Communist Party uses the Confucius Institutes and the Chinese Student Associations to put pressure on the students, on the faculty, not to say things that they don't like. And so they use those organizations to suppress speech. At the same time, they'll use those organizations to monitor and control the behavior of the Chinese students. So they want to make sure they don't become too Americanized, that they don't adopt American culture or American values. And then the third thing is, because they have 500,000 students in our university system, they are able to use that to take science and technology back to China. Now, the final thing that they've done is, because each of these students is essentially on full, out-of-state tuition rates, that they become such a big part of the university, earnings. So to the tune of, something like $15 billion a year, that the universities are loath to essentially stand up to them. So, for instance, if a university is going to have something like the, Dalai Lama come and speak, then, the consulate or the embassy can call the university president and say, look, if you do this, we're going to pull every Chinese student out of the university, and you're not going to be able to function. So, it becomes a way to essentially undermine our university system from within.
Explain, if you will, what China is doing in the South China Sea with the islands.
So back in the 80s, essentially they saw that the Vietnamese were essentially taking some of their territories that were in their EEZ, their economic zone, and essentially putting outposts on them. And so the Chinese Communist Party, believing that the South China Sea belongs to them, even though by international law it does not, told the People's Liberation Army, hey, you need to stop these outposts. And the People's Liberation Army said, well, we don't have the ability to have, sustained operations in that region. And so, from the 80s on, they waited until really after 2008, when they saw the West in this decline after the financial crisis, to begin to build islands and to essentially establish control over the South China Sea. So the Chinese Communist Party believes the South China Sea to be totally owned by them in contravention to international law, and they're basically creating the ability to, just like you would, create a force out there to be able to essentially enforce what you believe to be your claim.
Let's circle back to guilt. You had laid some of the blame on the United States, and our cavalier or casual approach to China. Explain some of that.
Well, so let's go back to where I said our retirement funds are sending money to Chinese companies. So these Chinese companies, like Alibaba, essentially list through American depository receipts in Hong Kong. So these are dollar-denominated, securities that then the investors purchase. So they're able to do that despite the fact that for these American depository receipts, the only thing that the SEC requires is a 30-page glossy. So they don't need to have a 10Q and a 10K. These are financial documents that all U.S. corporations have to have, and the corporations themselves have to be audited, and then the auditors are governed by the PCAOB, which is the auditing oversight agency. Well, the PCAOB can't actually audit Chinese auditors. So what happens is, because of all the SEC hasn't forced Chinese companies to comply with the same audit requirements, essentially all of these retirement funds are investing in these companies, and you don't actually know the investors don't know what they're investing in. So right there, the SEC could require that Chinese companies have to meet the same standards as U.S. companies. Of course, according to Chinese national security law, they cannot divulge any of the audit notes or papers to the U.S. because it's against the law. It's treason. So by allowing their companies to essentially list on our stock exchanges without having the same audit requirements, that's an outrage. That's one where I said that's an outrage. At the same time, U.S. corporations, if they have cash in China, okay, so if they have cash in the bank in China, they're listing these on their 10Qs and 10Ks as level 1 assets. That means that the directors and the corporate executives get bonuses based on the money that they're making in China, except in China you have a non-convertible currency and strict capital controls. So that means none of that money can actually be taken out, only in special circumstances, and only if the Chinese Communist Party says so. So in essence, we're allowing them to report on their financial statements that they have access to cash that they don't really have access to. Now, if you were to take that off and say, okay, you now have to report that as a level 3 asset, meaning it has no value, now corporate directors and executives would be compensated based on where they were actually making money that they could get access to, and they would incentivize them to invest in other places. So that's another. So those two examples are how we set our system to really advantage what they're doing.
It almost sounds as though, I asked somebody else this the other day, where Beijing is essentially nationalizing U.S. assets, corporate assets in China, which is kind of what Cuba and Venezuela did, correct?
That's exactly right, except they're not saying it. They're just making it impossible for you to get those assets out. I mean, which is what they do. They say one thing and they do another, and they do that all the time.
5G. I happen to be retired from the international telecommunications industry, and 5G has me very concerned, especially with ZTE and Huawei. Is my concern misplaced or on spot?
Oh, it's absolutely on spot. The 4G world, in the 4G world, the mobile phone, the smartphone, mostly led by Android and iOS, Apple and Google, are the main platforms for that. So the network itself is just a pipe for data. The app services and business models, the platform that's built on is a smartphone. In the 5G network, the computing and networking are all on the network. So the network becomes a platform, and that's what you build the app services and business models of the 5G world on. And because China has built that technology, and they're building it first in China, their companies like Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent will be the Facebook, Amazons, Netflix, and Googles of the future. And so what they want to do is have this seamless architecture, technology, and the business models on top of it, so that as they deploy this around the world, they're able to influence populations at essentially the individual level through their consumer behavior. And of course, because you are able now to collect data on everybody, you can make sure that if somebody's doing things that you don't want, you can say, hey, that university application your kid put in, because we've got so many Chinese students, we can just go to the administration and say, hey, we don't want that kid to be allowed in. So it really allows them a lot of power to suppress the folks that essentially would stand up to what they were doing. So, it's a really ingenious strategy. They're first deploying it at home, testing it out, perfecting it, and then because they lead 5G technology and they lead all the app services and business models on top of it, they're able to spread that through the Belt and Road Initiative, and everywhere they build Huawei, their companies can be dominant.
Got a minute or two left. I would say that Trump is at least bringing a spotlight to all things Beijing, and if he hadn't, we would really be, I would say, at least a decade behind where China is about to reach a new plateau. Would that be right?
No, I would say it'd be even worse than that. I think I was watching we were formulating what a strategy might look like in the Pentagon. This was back in 2016, and I'm looking at how the election's shaping up. I really believed at that point, if we didn't have an election where you could make some changes in China policy and begin to extract the United States and invest back in the country, that we were done as a democracy. So I was very thankful that we've gone on this new path, but that doesn't mean we're out of the water, because if we don't push back, if we don't fight for our freedom, we're just going to lose it, and it's going to be lost, and we're not even going to realize it.
Ladies and gentlemen, a big hat tip to Brigadier General Robert Spaulding, U.S. Air Force retired. The title of the book is Stealth War: How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept. Please go pre-order it on Amazon.com. I think that we are only, media is only giving us a snippet of what we should necessarily know, all things China. And I got to give you high praise, General, for writing the book. So we've got to understand things in context. It's very hard for us out here to do some critical thinking or strategic thinking when it comes to China and or Russia, I would say, because of the way media reports these things, and we need to have a bigger picture. So that I would offer that is the motivation of your book, Stealth War.
Absolutely. That's why I got out.
General, thanks so much for being with us. I hope you'll come back, because I think there's many, many moving parts to all things China. So congratulations, Stealth War, General Robert Spaulding. Ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way on the Denise Simon Experience, so stay with us.
The truth. The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Ziad, over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Ziad, out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Mike Charlie, 4 Tree 5, 9er 21. Grid to Mark. Mike Charlie, 47 Tree 9er, 8 9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds HEPT, gas TOT 53U.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Denise Simon Experience, heard worldwide on Mojo 50. Please help me welcome John Tamny back to the show. John is the director of economic freedom over at FreedomWorks. He's an author. He's a public speaker. He's an advisor. He's been everywhere. He's an overachiever, I would say, when it comes to economics and finance. And he's a smart man. So I got a couple of interesting questions I'm going to throw at poor John. But John, welcome to the Denise Simon Experience.
Hey, Denise, thanks for having me back. I'm very excited to be here.
All right, look, I have a challenge for you. And I think there's one of the universities in California that is now offering what is called an Adulting 101 class. And all kinds of students are signing up for it, which tells me that they're kind of desperate. And they're desperate because they don't understand economics, personal finance. But I would also argue that the generation, or at least two in front of these college students, don't understand economics and finance either. I'm going to take you way back. When I was in the 9th grade, I had one semester in a private boarding school of economics and never was talked about it again. And I went through a good system. Anyway, so my challenge to you is, and then you can tell me why I think this. I think you need to write some textbooks. If you can write and be the author of popular economics, I think you need to do it for the high school level. So you can have a class on personal finance. You can have a class on economic or finance law, the Fed, all these kinds of things. So because not only do millennials and Gen Z need to understand finance and economics, but the two generations in front of them do too. So I think we maybe need Adulting 202. Tell me, John, what are your thoughts on my proposal to you?
Well, the first thing I would say is I think the problem is that there are too many textbooks. Economics is too easy to reduce it to a textbook. It's just common sense. And so I do believe that I believe all these students, I believe these older generations, they intimately understand economics. They've just never had it explained to them in the right way. And that's what has me optimistic, though. I think people ultimately get it. They're not learning it in school just because most economists don't understand economics, but we go through life and we kind of figure out, well, the more I'm productive at work, the harder I work, the more things I'm able to get, the more comforts in life I'm able to enjoy. And as they start enjoying these comforts, they start recognizing, wait a second, why is it that governments at all levels want so much of it? And so I think reality tends to mug people, Americans in particular. So I will always be optimistic.
Okay, John, I'm not as optimistic and hopeful as you, especially when we're looking at the 2020 political candidates running for the White House, because I don't think I have a sense that they understand economics, but they're selling something else. And when you've got somebody like Elizabeth Warren, who's got 12 or 15,000 people that show up at a rally, and same with Bernie Sanders, then I think we've got to unwind some things. We need to reteach, don't we?
Do I like Elizabeth Warren? I think the ideas she espouses are horrifying. You don't have to convince me for a second what dangerous thought she has going through her head. At the same time, what I would say is if she tried to do that on a national level, she would very quickly find the Senate in Republican hands, and she'd find the House in Republican hands. I think people say lots of crazy things during primaries that they could never do. Look, the American people are not socialist. They're nowhere close to being socialist. They don't buy it. And the evidence supporting this claim is look after the election in 2016, that everyone thought Republicans were going to lose. Coming out of the election, they had the White House, Senate, House. They had control of the Supreme Court, control of 2/3 of governorships, 2/3 of state legislators. The American people are not socialist, and they're not going to vote for it. So I don't worry about it.
All right. I'm going to trust you on that one. So let's trot on over to, I would say, the United States finance policy. And we'll start with the Federal Reserve. I think we need to be, ourselves as adults, need to be re-taught what the Federal Reserve is and what their duties are. It's managing money, or managing the cost of money. What does that really mean for us, John?
Well, this is the good news. The Fed could no more manage or control the cost of credit than you or I could. The Fed, think about all these years, the Fed tried to keep us at zero, but most people couldn't borrow anywhere close to zero. Even Apple, the most valuable corporation in the world, was paying 3% to borrow. And so there's this myth that the Fed controls things. No, it doesn't. The Fed, we're such a dynamic economy. The idea that those clowns at the Fed could somehow set the stage for economic growth for all of us. That's why I don't understand why we Republicans say, wouldn't it be great if the Fed cut rates? You think this economy is relying on those guys? And so, the Fed purports to set the cost of credit. It purports to regulate banks. It can't do any of those things. It had so many regulators at Citigroup back in 2008. Did you think they had a clue about what was going on at Citi? The Fed is so yesterday. We're putting it out of business right before our eyes.
But then Wall Street pays attention.
It's a very good point, and you're right. Look, they do. But I think even there, if you're so kind to have me back on your show in 5 years, I remember this conversation. I think even by then, the consensus will be that even Wall Street has tuned the Fed out. Because you have to remember, the banks that the Fed tries to express its influence over the economy are really a shrinking part of the total lending in the U.S. They're roughly 15%, and that number's in rapid decline. And so Wall Street watches it kind of as out of habit, but how much does it respond to it? I don't think it means very much. Look, the Bank of Japan had rates of zero for years. Did that cause stocks to rise there? No, it didn't. What causes stocks to rise is innovation, dynamic people, and that's what the U.S. has in spades.
But, we have a global monetary system, or a network, or a proposed or assumed one. The International Monetary Fund, the European Bank system, and obviously our own Federal Reserve. So, you've got interest rates sitting at, 3% out of argument, or 4% out of argument, but yet you've got mortgage loans, you've got car loans, you've got credit card loans that go from the sublime to the ridiculous. Why are we just all over the place on those?
Well, I would say it's a good sign. Look, the Fed had loans at zero for years, but could you and I go get a home loan for anywhere close to zero? No. Could we just go borrow tens of millions to start a business? No. And my point there is that while the Fed pretends that it controls the cost of credit, in the real economy, it doesn't. It's easier to borrow for a house simply because there's something for a bank to recover. A house is kind of a low-risk loan. But if you and I want to start a business, odds are we'd have to give up equity in the business. No one's going to lend to us simply because there might not be any revenues to recover. And so I say all this just to be very optimistic about the Fed's not nearly as powerful as it purports to be, and thank goodness it isn't, because the kind of incompetent people who work there, it'd be really dangerous for us if they did have power.
Do each of the Federal Reserves operate independently of each other, or do they just kind of follow the lead of the Fed chair?
Well, it's a good question. Certainly for interest rate policy, there's a desire for consensus. The Supreme Court, there's lots of 5-4 votes. With the Fed, they're usually, it's 8-1 or 9-0 votes. For the local Fed offices, it's more about just keeping track of local banks, which again, I would say is wholly unnecessary, but that's what they do. I really want to stress that I don't think the Fed's very important. People talk about ending the Fed, and I'm all for ending what makes no sense, and the Fed makes no sense. But I've always argued that market forces are ending the Fed for us because we're such an innovative, dynamic economy. The idea that we'd be reliant on what these guys do with interest rates, it's not a serious idea.
If you were going to be part of a congressional hearing, let's say from the Ways and Means Committee or the House Finance Committee, what 3 points would you like to make to those committees?
The first one I would make is that the rich create all the jobs, and I'm serious about that. And they do, because they've got all the money. And so when we tax them less, they really have no choice but to invest it. And when they invest it, new ideas, they have the means to lose money on new ideas. And that's how you get progress. Detroit was a great center of economic activity at a time when most of its businesses were failing in the early part of the 20th century. Silicon Valley thrives now, but most of its businesses fail, and rich people make those investments. And so when you raise taxes on the rich, that means that less businesses will form, and that means that there will be fewer job opportunities for the typical earner. So I think that's the crucial thing to say, that it's unspent wealth that drives progress. So I would argue that first. I would also argue that every single American earns dollars. And so when politicians make it their policy, we want a weaker dollar. What you're saying is that we want to reduce the value of the paycheck of every single American. And I think that's a very dangerous path to go on, but politicians pretend it's a good one.
I remember many years ago living in Atlanta and listening to Neil Bortz, and this goes back an awful lot of years, and he made the statement, stuck with me ever since, obviously, and he said, I never got a job from a poor person.
Yeah, isn't that true? And it's so important. I don't know why Republicans run from this. They say, well, we're thinking about cutting taxes. We're going to make it for the middle class. But see, middle class earners know exactly where they want to be, and they're thinking, see, they get it intuitively. How many people do you know who say, oh, hey, Denise, I'm moving tomorrow to Charleston, West Virginia, or Jackson, Mississippi? You never hear that, but you hear people all the time moving to cities where there's lots of rich people, because where there are rich people, that's where the jobs are.
Yeah. Which means that, you've got a free enterprise system, you've got a capitalist system, and there seems to be a constant attack on that whole business model. Now, if you're going to be in a debate with a Bernie Sanders and it was going to be televised, how do you neutralize Bernie Sanders, or for that matter, any of the rest of them?
Oh, I would neutralize him by saying you can't stop pretending that you love the common man when everything about you is about limiting the common man's opportunities. Because when you go against business, when you make it your goal to tax away wealth, what you're taxing away is the very dollars that will make the creation of new companies and new jobs possible. It cannot be stressed enough that I would love to pay lower taxes. But if you reduced my taxes, I've got bills to pay. There's things that I need. I don't have the means to invest. But if you greatly reduce the taxes of Jeff Bezos, he can put billions to work into new ideas that will employ all of us, make us more productive. And so to go after the rich is the quickest way to put a bullseye on those who aren't rich.
But devil's advocate here, and my hands are on my hips, and I'm stomping my feet, John, and that is, but we have all these federal programs that we have to pay for, so we need the tax revenue, and we want a Jeffrey Bezos and the Koch brothers to pay for it.
Yeah, and my response to that is, why do we have cell phones in our pockets that are also supercomputers? Why is it that we have air conditions in our houses, air conditioner window units that we get for $100 that used to cost $50,000? Why is it that we all have computers in our pockets and on our desktops that cost a few $100s when they used to cost millions of dollars? Well, we do because of capitalists. Capitalists get rich by virtue of mass producing former luxuries that we never imagined owning. Let's never forget that the automobile in the year 1900 was incredibly rare. It was rarer than millionaires, and millionaires were incredible. If you knew someone who had a car, that was a sign that you ran in high circles. Henry Ford mass-produced it and made it possible for people to own. Steve Jobs mass-produced the smartphone. And my point here is if you want to get things to people, the last thing you do is rely on the federal government. You'd instead rely on these same capitalists that you bash because that's what they do all the time. They take what only the rich enjoy and make it possible for us to all enjoy.
We have a agency called the Consumer Protection Board, which is, I want to, personally, I want it to implode. Am I right in saying that?
You're absolutely 100% right to want it to implode. Why would we need a consumer protection agency? Why don't we instead say, hey, the markets are free? Because guess what? When markets are free, when anyone can compete to serve your needs, my needs, all the listeners' needs, that's the greatest consumer protection. Because if one business chooses to treat you poorly, you've got numerous options.
Competition.
So, yeah, competition is the ultimate regulator. Nothing else comes close.
I spent many years in the retail business, and I had a boss that once said, competition makes you stronger. And yet we seem to want to eliminate it, and we compete against government regulations here at this point. Are we eliminating enough government regulations on business, banks, and all the rest?
No. Let me first say that your boss was
Easy
absolutely
answer.
Right. Competition makes you stronger. Are we eliminating enough? No. And to be clear, this isn't some anti-government rant. It's just logic. With regulators, we're asking them to see into the future and detect trouble spots. Well, if you could do that, you wouldn't work as a regulator. You'd be earning billions of dollars a year as an investor. So we're asking the impossible of regulators. We're asking people who generally couldn't get jobs in certain industries to regulate them. Now, how do you think that works? For anyone who's smart, they just know how to work around these guys, and invariably they do. It's always free market investors who find problems in companies. It's never regulators. And so we're just slowing business down while doing nothing to make the consumer safer.
I think you're writing the textbook here that I wanted you to write.
It's all in popular economics, among others.
Tax policy. Trotting back on over to the House Ways and Means Committee, I would argue probably the most powerful committee that we have in government. If you were to address some things with the House Ways and Means Committee when it comes to tax policy, what would that be?
The first thing I would do, again, if I'm in a perfect world and you and I are running it, I would say to Ways and Means that it's wrong that the American people have to prove their income to anyone. Let me be clear. I'm not anti-government. I'm anti-national government. If people want to choose a lot of local government, public schools, public parks, I have no problem with that. Pay for it locally and kind of choose the size of your government. That's what the United States was founded. But nationally, I would say we shouldn't be proving our income. And we also, it shouldn't be just because Jeff Bezos has much more money than I do that he owes more than I do. I think the number should ideally be, if we can't get a consumption tax, which would overtax the rich, we've got to have something where we don't have to prove our income. And we have to have something that we can avoid taxation. So I guess the best way would be consumption. This way, no one has to know how much we earn. And then if you and I decide, okay, they're doing a lousy job this year, we can go elsewhere and stop paying taxes for a time. It's the only way that we can limit what the government gets.
Money management by government, I think, causes fear in the little guy out here, such that spending or investment is probably a more cautious action than it necessarily should be. Is that a correct statement?
I think what you're saying is that people are never as careful with the money of others as they are with their own.
Touche.
and yes, and precisely why you want government to be local, then people can have some control over it. They may know the person. They can run into them and say, hey, we don't like this. We don't like how you allocated the funds. The problem with the national is that they're just creating one size fits all alleged solutions when we're all different. And there are so many examples of this, but think about recently, Burger King wanted to roll out the Impossible Burger that's a plant-based burger. Now, for me, I have zero interest in that. I like red meat. But what did Burger King do? It said, we're going to roll it out not nationally. We're going to roll it out in St. Louis. We are going to test this market. Think about what that means. Kentucky Fried Chicken just announced today that it's going to test plant-based fried chicken, not nationally, but in Atlanta. That's what we do as individuals because you don't want to risk nationalizing a failure. Yet what does the federal government do all the time? It has national policies. Is it any surprise that they fail so totally? Well, of course they do. In any reasonably run country, what we would do is we'd say, okay, California, you've got some ideas. Try them out there. Try them out in Santa Monica. And if they work, we might mimic them. So we've gone about this the wrong way. Let the spending be local and let people choose how much that it's going to be.
2 minutes or less, Mr. John Tamny. Eliminating student debt, forgiving all of that. Thoughts?
Oh, what a bad idea. It would create the incentive for people to just get as much education as possible. I would also say, and some will say this is elitist, in my next book, it's titled They're Both Wrong. Everyone should buy several copies of it. But I make the point in the book, I say, the worst thing about student debt is not that government's involved. Look, I think Harvard would be expensive with or without government offering student loans. The shame about student debt is that it used to be that paying one's way through college was the only way that the non-connected person who could only afford the local school could compete with the well-connected Harvard kids. Because that person could say, you know what, I got myself through it. And that means a lot more to businesses than the classes you took at school. And so I think government, once again, in trying to help the little guy, has robbed the little guy of the way to basically showcase himself against the well-connected kids are always going to have a way into schools that we won't. Yes. But it used to be, I worked my way through, I did it on my own, and it's a shame that government's taken that from people.
A lot of bartending and waitressing jobs that are out there. And well said. I like that whole thing. That's probably the largest missing component. And I would argue that, I helped my son pay his way through college, didn't borrow from anybody. So if everybody else gets loan forgiveness, I want a refund.
Yeah, that's right. So it's not fair to the people to do it. College used to mean a lot more, and it used to mean a lot more because it represented sacrifice. It was tougher to get through it, and it was tougher to pay for it. Shame on government for making it easy because, again, the well-connected will always have connections.
Ladies and gentlemen, big, huge round of applause to John Tamny, author, speaker, advisor, writer. Excellent job. Certainly a lot to think about. Mr. John, thanks so much for being with us, and we appreciate all your good work. Ladies and gentlemen, stay with us on the Denise Simon Experience. More coming your way.
Thank you so much.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Denise Simon Experience, heard worldwide on Mojo 50. For those of you that may not remember or know who Howard Zinn was, we're going to actually talk about Howard Zinn because I have the distinct pleasure of being joined by Mary Grabar. Mary has completed a project, a book. I got to give her a trophy for this one. She's decided to take on Howard Zinn's lies about American history. Howard, I think, has written a pile of books. He's dead now, I think, if I recall right. And Mary has decided to tell everybody that everything that we were taught, our students were recently taught in schools through Howard Zinn textbooks, were twisted, just twisted. Mary Grabar, congratulations on doing this book, How One Man Turned a Generation Against America, Debunking Howard Zinn. Thank you for doing this.
Oh, well, thank you for having me on. It was a challenge.
It had to be a challenge. Mary, he's written so many books, and I would say that he really he was a academic activist and a historical activist, kind of to turn the goodness and the grace of the United States upside down. So he was really an author that was an activist. Is that about right?
Yeah, that is right. Howard Zinn is dead. As you mentioned, he died in 2010 at the age of 87. He was a legitimate historian. He could do legitimate history. He earned a PhD from Columbia. But he was also a member of the Communist Party officially during the late 40s and into about 1953, although he denied it all the time, and he denied it to the FBI when they questioned him. He did write one scholarly book, which was his dissertation that he turned into a book published, I think, by Cornell University Press. But after that, he wrote nothing else that I could find that was even remotely legitimate history or scholarship. So what he did is he used his experience in the classroom teaching at Spelman College and at Boston University as forums for indoctrinating students, agitating, radicalizing students, and wrote for a number of radical publications. And my focus is on his most famous book, which is A People's History of the United States, which was published in 1980. It's been in publication ever since and has broken all records in terms of sales for a book of its type, over 2.6 million copies sold. It's the kind of book that publishers love because it sells both as a textbook and both as a general interest book. So what Zinn did in this book is he used it as a means by which to propagate his communist ideology.
Terrifying, isn't it? And Mary, in all of your work to research this, did anybody really push back? Did anybody challenge him in any of this, or they did and it was just kind of minimized?
Yeah, a lot of people have gotten very angry, when they've read A People's History of the United States. I mean, he was a radical during his life. He led students on protests, trying to get them thrown in jail, led the anti-Vietnam War movement, was probably the most visible college professor leading the anti-Vietnam War movement, brought back 3 American prisoners of war with Father Berrigan for propaganda purposes. So he was disliked, for his activities. And a number of people have written articles that have attacked him. I mean, he's also been attacked by his colleagues on the left for A People's History of the United States because he presents such a dismal picture of the United States that nothing ever works. And of course, these people on the left who are in anti-war movements and civil rights movements and, consider themselves progressive, are a little distraught because he's not giving credit to all these movements on the left. There have been several articles over the years by conservatives attacking him for his anti-Americanism, he drips with hatred for this country. And and I started writing about him more than 10 years ago. I presented a report, and I've written articles from time to time and tracked the use of Howard Zinn in the classroom. And I, too, was angered, by this distorted picture that he presents of the United States. But in the course of my research over the last couple years while I was writing this book, I discovered that it was worse than I had thought it would be. First I thought this is a really extreme leftist perspective, and he's just sort of slanting things. But I discovered that he twisted authors' words around to mean the opposite of what they said. He left out critical information. He plagiarized rampantly. Here he was held up as this great historian and writing, this best-selling book, but so much of it's plagiarized. He violated every rule of history writing put out by the American Historical Association. So it's not just that he is, a far left hater of America. It's that he wrote this book that is not legitimate history. Just as, a book by someone who would deny the Holocaust would be, or someone who would deny that slavery existed, we wouldn't want those books in our, in children's classrooms or in college students' classrooms. But Howard Zinn has been used for almost 40 years now.
Yeah, Mary, you can kind of tell some of that, and based on where we are in the tribal divisions we have going on today. If I was to say that he was actually selling historical theory first in all of his autherings, that's autherings plural, versus facts, would that be accurate?
I would say he's selling lies. I mean, I can give you a couple examples if you'd like. I mean, this is something I came across. His opening pages, which are probably the most famous about Christopher Columbus being greeted by the Arawaks, right? And he presents, Christopher Columbus as this kind of a genocidal maniac, who was, just lusting for gold and enslaving the gentle natives, chopping off their hands if they couldn't produce and so forth. Well, much of that is plagiarized from a short paperback book for high school students written by his comrade in the anti-Vietnam War movement, Hans Koning. Koning was not a historian. He was a novelist, and it's a screed, but it's written at the high school level. and I would honestly, I'm up here in Clinton, New York, and so I decided to go to his bibliography. He doesn't provide any footnotes, but he does have a bibliography, and I checked this book out, and I had gone through Zinn's books a few times, and I started reading Koning, and I was like, this is really familiar. This sounds so familiar. It's kind of like the feeling I had when I would grade student papers. You're sitting there thinking, this doesn't sound right. I've read it someplace else. And there it was in Koning's book. And all Zinn did was shift things around a little bit, change a word here and there. And it's writing that would have gotten any college freshman, probably kicked out of college. So he does that. But what he also does is he does quote from Columbus's diary, and he hasn't read all the diaries, of course, but so he quotes him with this passage: "They would make fine servants," with the 4 ellipses, to indicate an omission. "With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." And so that's part of Zinn's evidence for the, fact, as he maintains, that Columbus was this genocidal maniac. Well, the first thing is they would make fine servants is in reference to Columbus thinking about how another tribe that is trying to overthrow them would see them. They see them as fine servants because they really are relatively gentle people, not that they don't defend themselves. And then that ellipses, those 4 dots that leave out a passage, that's for 2 days worth of writing of his journal entry. You use the ellipses to indicate a phrase or a sentence or two that's missing. But one of the sentences from those 2 days is, I know that they are a people who can be made free and converted to our holy faith more by love than by force. Now that's quite different from, subjugating them, enslaving them. Christopher Columbus felt that it was his Christian mission as a discoverer, to convert the natives. So he was trying to save their souls. He thought that they should convert them with love, not by force, and he instructed his men to treat them kindly. Now, his men didn't always obey him, but Christopher Columbus intended for them to be treated well. You don't get any of that in Howard Zinn's, rendition of Christopher Columbus. And then there's another part about Vietnam. Howard Zinn claims that the Viet Cong were really just friends of the South Vietnamese, that they were coming into their villages and teaching them, quote, communication strategies. And he claims that this author, Douglas Pike, from whom he's quoting, his message or meaning is that, yes, the Viet Cong are teaching communication lessons. Now, Douglas Pike was an American Foreign Service officer in Vietnam from 1960 to 1965, and he got to know the Vietnamese, and he became friends with them. He had a great affection for them. But what Zinn describes as communication strategies that he quotes out of context from Douglas Pike is part of Douglas Pike's description of the agitprop, the Maoist indoctrination, and the terrorism of the Viet Cong. So Zinn makes it out to appear that the Viet Cong were the friends of the villagers, where Pike is saying, no, he says they're committing genocide. And Pike, in his book, in the introduction, pleads with the American people, please come help these villagers. The Viet Cong are here, they're causing trouble, they're terrorizing these people, executing them in front of others. That's the legacy of Douglas Pike now, because if you look up the words that Zinn quotes, on Google, which is what everyone does, especially students, you get Douglas Pike as Zinn is presenting him. So those are just a couple examples. And so when I set out, to really look at this book in depth, I knew it was bad, but I didn't think these would be so egregious. I mean, has no one caught this in 40 years? I mean,
well, that's what I'm thinking. When you wrote this, you probably took one approach, and then as you're getting into the middle of it, I think the direction kind of changed because you just found that it was so ridiculous, right? Yeah,
I mean, any historian who would, so blatantly plagiarize, so blatantly twist words around, leave out essential information would be, kicked out of the profession. In the background chapter, I talk about others, like you may have heard of Doris Kearns Goodwin, right? She's been, accepted back into the fold, but around the year 2000, she had been caught plagiarizing. And I think she'd been caught more than once. And at one time, it involved, giving the other author from whose work she stole a large settlement, undisclosed amount. And when it was revealed that, Doris Kearns Goodwin did this, she was kicked off the Pulitzer Prize board. She lost her gig at PBS. and you didn't hear from her, for a while. I mean, she's back now.
She's back now, yes.
Yeah, it's years later, it took years and years, but nothing ever happened to Howard Zinn. He just grew in popularity. Nobody said, well, wait a minute, you stole my work. Hans Koning was a man of the left. He probably was, rooting him on and saying, yeah, go, let's tear down Columbus. Let's abolish Columbus Day, which is what the Zinn Education Project is doing. Telling teachers to take their students on these campaigns to abolish Columbus Day, and they're doing that at the Smithsonian next month.
I have a feeling that if you were standing in the same classroom as Howard Zinn, and he discussed a chapter in any one of his books, and then you got to discuss the correction of that chapter, your work would be twice as hard as his presentation, because people want to believe the worst first, correct?
Yes, I think that's the way students feel these days. And the other thing, he's also very slippery in his language use. I go into the rhetorical strategies. Why is this unbelievably dark picture of the United States believed by people? Well, he makes emotional appeals. He describes suffering. He harangues the oppressors, the Europeans. He asks these leading questions. He also says that everyone coming before him has hidden this history, and he is revealing it for the first time.
Oh.
And he does it. It's very clever, and it's particularly appealing to adolescents. When you have these students who are in that phase of their lives where, no one can tell them anything, right? They know it all. Their parents, their teachers, they're all stupid, right? Most kids go through that phase. Well, there's Howard Zinn, speaking to them through the pages of his book and saying, everything you've been told about history is wrong.
Well, when you're a teacher or a professor and you've got a class of students, whether you're in high school or at the university level, you tend to look at that teacher or professor with some kind of authority, because obviously they've been teaching this for a while, and there's the inference that you're supposed to believe. And right? Yeah. Surely they wouldn't be handing us something that is plagiarized or fake or twisted. I mean, we should. I mean, I get it. I have a son that's in his mid-30s, and still to this day is, Mom, I learned this in school. Well, that doesn't mean it's right, son.
Yeah, exactly. And it's teachers who are giving students, the Howard Zinn books to use in classroom, especially if they're in the advanced placement U.S. history courses. These are being used openly now. It used to be that teachers would only, admit to sneaking in photocopied pages and then collecting them at class. I've heard that at conferences. But now they're doing it openly. Here, where I am, Hamilton College is right here. Students tell me about this professor who recommends that they read A People's History of the United States. I went to my little village library here. I was looking for books on Vietnam for my Vietnam War chapter, and there was a book for middle schoolers on Vietnam, and there were 4 passages from Howard Zinn's A People's History for middle school students, So you have, 4 pages of material from his book, and Howard Zinn is presented as, a respected historian. So, get them while they're young. I mean, there's even a young people's history of the United States. So it's been adapted for elementary school students, which is really scary.
You've got a Herculean task in front of you to unwind all of this, and I would even say that it's playing out across the landscape of the United States. I mean, we're removing monuments for the wrong reasons. Legislators that are supposed to, have the resources to look at history and see what is good or what is bad, and whatever. I mean, we're seeing this play out here, not only at the federal level, but we're seeing it at the state level. It's got to frustrate you, Mary, right?
It does, and I'm hoping, that maybe some lawmakers will get a hold of this book. A couple of the cases that I present. One is of a state representative in Arkansas called Kim Hendren, and a couple years ago he introduced a bill that would prohibit the use of Howard Zinn's books in public schools. It went nowhere. Yeah, because, I fought Common Core when I lived in Georgia, and I know what happens is that these lawmakers come up against this wall of professors who claim to be the experts. And so they're sort of at a loss. And so if you're, a state representative or something, you've got a good education, you've got common sense, and if you've got common sense, you can see that there's something wrong with Zinn's book. But what you're facing are these people who say, well, you're just a conservative, you don't like Howard Zinn's views. So that's why I wrote this book, to show, well, no, it's not, it's not just that he is, far left, is promoting communism. It's that his facts are wrong, his techniques, his strategies in history writing violate every rule of history writing. So, the book, I hope will be able to provide some ammunition, for a comeback. Someone who says, well, Howard Zinn was opposed to the Vietnam War, and a lot of people were too, and, there's nothing wrong with teaching that to students. I mean, you can see there, how he twists Douglas Pike's words, and, and of course Howard Zinn, he pretended to have so much sympathy for Indians and
he didn't.
Certain people, but when it came to the boat people of Vietnam, there's not a peep out of him about that, or other victims of communism. So I'm hoping that we can start to attack the use of Howard Zinn's books in classrooms, because I think we're seeing it, 10, 15 years ago when I was still teaching, I would talk to people and they'd say, I'm glad I'm not in that crazy world of academia. I'm here in the business world, I'm here in the real world. But these days you can't escape it. If you go to a restaurant,
that's it.
Right? They'll chase you out. You have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez calling the ICE facilities, the concentration camps. I mean, that's what Zinn says about the camps for the Japanese Americans during World War II. And boy, does he twist around the reality of that. But, you've got these millennials that are spouting the same ideas. The guy that tried to blow up the facility in Tacoma, Washington, right? Remember that about a month ago? Well, in his manifesto, he said, read Howard Zinn.
Right. I saw it.
Yeah. So, whether or not you have children in school or grandchildren, or whether you care about education, you're not going to be able to escape the influence of Howard Zinn, because he has influenced, a couple generations. So, as I say in my book, people who grew up reading him in the 1980s and the 1990s now have their kids who are going to be passing it on to their children, and they know of no other version of American history. And, and I might also add that his book is very popular in colleges of education. And often the teachers, have his book in their classroom, but don't have any other book to counter it. So this is the version that they get and that they pass on to their students.
And I'm of the notion, I mean, you mentioned, a generation or so of students, but I would also say that they're also influencing the parents that weren't taught under Howard Zinn, because parents are thinking, okay, maybe we have come a long way in history, and there's a lot of history that's being corrected, so my child is being taught corrected history. So then you have to undo the parents too, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, I interviewed this one young woman who's now very successful, and Howard Zinn, in 2005, he was, still alive, and her high school teacher made the whole class read a people's history from cover to cover, and then Howard Zinn came in and talked to them, and I describe her impressions of him. She was not favorably impressed.
No.
But she also pointed out that none of the parents objected.
Precisely, and that's the scary part of it all, because they don't know they don't know which track to take. And we come a long way in history and in research, and we tend to think what is in schools today, regardless at what level or what grade level, they have to be teaching the right stuff, because they have the resources now, and they've had the internet and access to so much research. Ladies and gentlemen, huge praise for Mary Grabar. Mary, this topic can go on forever, and it should, I would say. She is the author of Debunking Howard Zinn, Exposing the Fake History That Turned a Generation Against America, and it may almost need to be generations, plural.
Yeah.
I'm so delighted that you took on this challenge, and I want to see that you end up sending a copy to everybody in both chambers of Congress. Just for fun, I want you to do that, but get your publisher out there to do that. Thank you for the hard work on this, and thank you for sharing all of this with us. I'm keeping your contact information close because I want to revisit this, especially as we get into the shank of the school year. So high praise, Miss Mary Grabar. Thank you for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a real pleasure having you along for the ride on the Denise Simon Experience, heard on Mojo 50. We'll see you again very soon.